We're from Keyword Studio. We're an external development partner for game developers and publishers. We supply anything from localization, audio, engineering, player support, art, and testing for any of your game support needs. My name is Gabriel Tutone, and before joining Keywords, I was at Bungie Studios for 5 years working on localization.
And my name is Elina, and before coming and working with Keywords, I spent about 15 years localizing games for various companies, including Blizzard and EA and Obsidian Entertainment here in California. And today we would like to talk about gender-inclusive language and its localization challenges. And our goal is to raise awareness and to start an educated debate on the matter, because as localizers, we want video games to be as inclusive as possible and to make sure that we reach everyone and that everyone feels reflected in video games. And before explaining what gender-inclusive language is, let's try to understand first what genderization means. If we look at the definition of the verb to genderize in the dictionary, we will see that it means to make distinctions according to gender, something that we do on a daily basis even without noticing it. And depending on your own language, you might be wondering if this refers to grammatical gender or to semantic gender. And this is because not all languages have the same gender system.
If we take a look at Europe, we'll find at least 5 different systems, ranging from non-gendered languages, like English and Finnish, languages with common or neuter gender, like Dutch and Danish, languages with masculine and feminine, like Spanish, French, Italian, and languages with masculine, feminine, and neuter gender, German and Russian. On top of that, we even have languages that distinguish between animate and inanimate objects in Basque.
So what is this inclusive language that we are talking about? It is a form of language that is not biased toward a particular sex or social representation of gender. Gender neutrality should be used mainly in 2 cases. The first one is when gender of the person we refer to is unknown or indeterminable, and when we want to include in our speech people who identify themselves as non-binary or genderless. In many languages, the use of masculine forms to refer to generic groups is a standard. But in the last 2 years, academic and governmental entities are beginning to rely on gender-neutral language to convey inclusion of all sexes and genders. And advocates of gender inclusiveness consider that gendered language often implies male superiority and reflects an unequal state of society. And detractors argue that trying to use gender-inclusive language often leads to unnatural grammatical constructions. And there have always been female players and gender-fluid players, but only recently they've gained visibility. And let's take a look at what some developers have done to reflect these communities and how this is reflected in English.
Our first example is from The Sims. The Sims was one of the first AAA games to normalize same-sex relationships, but EA went even a step further in The Sims 4, where they removed binary male and female categories from the character creation menu. In The Sims 4, any sim can have any body type, clothing, hair, tone of voice, walk style, or accessories. And players can even decide if they want their character to use the toilet standing up or if they want their character to get pregnant. Another example we have is Fallen London, a web game developed by Fail Better Games and released in 2009. The game gives the player a 3rd genderless option during character creation. And players who choose this 3rd option will not be addressed throughout the game as male or female. A few years later, and after taking into consideration the feedback from the players, the same developer released Sunless Sea. In this case, instead of giving the option to choose gender, the game asked players for their preferred form of address, implying that gender is up to the players and may not match how they would like to be addressed. In Sunless Sea, we can also find androgynous characters. In this example, we see the alarming scholar, who is described using masculine and feminine pronouns, and the game ends up referring to the character as neutrally as possible. Even the use of adjectives seems to be done in a way that supports a certain degree of neutrality. As linguists and localizers, how can we deal with this kind of content and introduce gender inclusiveness or neutrality in our translations? This can be difficult in English, but it gets even more complicated when we need to translate it into different languages, especially those with grammatical genders like Spanish, French, Italian, and German. Some generic solutions that would work for all languages are listed here. For example, we could use non-gender specific terms as mentioned at the beginning. For example, you could use police officer instead of policeman or policewoman, they, them instead of he, him, she, her. However, this leads to convoluted or sometimes less natural languages in cases where it's not easy to find generic terms. In some languages, profession names are still gender marks, so we don't even have this option. Another example or another solution would be duplicating structures in the source files for all the different gender options. However, this is more costly for the developers as the word count to be translated gets multiplied by the different target languages and is higher. Not to mention the not to mention the effort behind adding multiple strings for all the different options. Another solution would be finding neutral structures whenever possible, which is definitely common practice among professional localizers, who usually need to handle variables and placeholders without knowing what term will be replacing them. However, this is not always possible, and sometimes it might lead to long and complex sentences, introducing truncations or overlaps, especially mobile versions of games.
So let's take a look at several examples and see how languages currently are dealing with inclusivity. So in French, we are witnessing almost a reinvention of the language. For instance, gender-inclusive pronouns are being created, and they blend the non-masculine and feminine forms into one. And unfortunately, I don't know how to pronounce this. Maybe someone else. But a more popular solution from what I see online every day is that people try to add a gender ending between two full stops to include female, cher ami. So this refers to both male and female friends. And in German, there is a solution when we can use an asterisk to indicate that there are more variations than just the ones displayed. And for example, der, die Priesterin indicate that this refers both to male and female. In Russian, though, this is my favorite because I'm Russian, it becomes even more complicated because we have three genders, masculine, feminine, and neutral, and we have like different kinds of endings for both verbs and pronouns and adjectives and participles. And for me, it's been always a big challenge to work around the source text to make sure that the phrase is applicable to both players in who are male, female, or even genderless. And usually, linguists use the second person plural, as this verb form has no gender ending or passive voice. In both cases, it is very difficult to avoid verbosity or even archaic or more official style. So to give like a simple example, we could think of this sentence. Yesterday, I found a nice cake recipe, right? And if I try to translate it into Russian, there will be two verb forms for masculine and feminine. And if I do not know who the speaker is, it becomes even more difficult because now I have to work around. And usually we try to make it as impersonal as possible, but then it becomes like, yesterday a chance was given to me to look at this cake recipe, which is like really ridiculous. And recently there has been a lot of discussion about including so-called feminitives, and these profession names that refers to women. And so, for example, when in English police officer is a neutral word and expression, in Russian there is no way to choose something neutral because it will either be masculine or feminine.
In Spanish, the generic masculine is the accepted form to address groups of male and female individuals. And the same is also for Italian. We have a few options to avoid this. So for example, you can use in Spanish at or x to replace the letter that would set the gender of a word. Though this isn't officially recognized by the academia, this has been a common use in the last few years. There is one inconvenience though. These characters cannot be pronounced or read by text-to-speech applications, which affects the dubbing of the game audio and prevents people with visual impairments from relying on that kind of software. So as said, yeah, Italian is also a strongly gendered language where even objects have a grammatical gender. This makes talking about a person without defining gender almost impossible. So in the LGBT community in Italian, it is common to use the asterisk to replace the a and the o in words. So bambino, bambina becomes bambin asterisk, which is fairly hard to read and it really is pretty niche. So I'm Italian, and yeah, I really haven't seen this much in common language. It is used in the LGBT community though, and hopefully it will expand its usage more in the future, but it still is pretty niche. Yeah, like Spanish, there's also the possibility to use at to indicate plural. However, yeah, the usage of these symbols is quite inconsistent, and if it were used for every single word, the text would just be full of asterisks and symbols every other word of the text.
So what are the main challenges that we deal with when we start localizing any given project? So most of all, using non-gender specific terms is less natural and it leads to convoluted language, as we already seen when I tried to make an example on Russia. And duplicating string structures is more costly for developers and can raise the cost for localization as well because it raises the word count. And restructuring the sentence may introduce length issues, which becomes quite an important issue when we deal with web-based games. And on top of that, gender-inclusive language is used mostly in written speech, and it is not supported in dubbing, of course, and in text-to-speech engines.
So as you can see, we do not possess definitive answers on how to overcome the challenges that this matter poses for the localization teams. We want to raise awareness and open an educated debate on the topic, trying to find solutions in the long run that allow us to keep up with the developers who have considered gender-inclusive language important. Some game companies employ sensitivity readers to ensure that their original text and localized text are free of gendered language, as well as free of prejudices and misconceptions that are usually associated to non-binary people. If a game includes LGBTQ characters, it would be recommended to have a gamer from this group check the content and make sure that no prejudices make it to the final build. We need to think of this figure as an external consultant who will help us ensure the final quality of the final product. And yeah, in conclusion, society changes, and in an industry with an ever-growing presence of women and non-binary people across all strata, it is only fair to reflect this diversity through language and give visibility to all of us involved in it. Thank you, and yeah, if you have any questions.